Okay. Okay, so welcome back. I don't know if am I sharing the screen?
No, and group one is not back.
Oh, group one's not back yet?
No, they're all busy.
Well, we need them.
I'm gonna close it.
Close their room. Close their room. Okay, so I was trying to share this. Let's see if it does it properly. No, it's sharing documents and not the people. So I can see everyone right now, which is really exciting. Can you guys see everyone in your group, like the whole class? Their pictures? No. I think there's when you look at the view, I don't know, I have an enter full screen option, but it's showing me everyone right now. So great. So group one, can you share with us your question?
Yeah. Sorry, I was in the middle of taking a bite. So, so this one is from the Shigori Miller Power, Chapter 3. And I'll give you a little context. Since action research is a big part of the teaching profession, how do we ensure that we get signed permissions from the parents of all of our students when we are technically always evaluating and investigating data without permissions? How do we know where the boundary is?
Jump in, folks.
Open it up, yeah. Unmute yourselves.
I think they said that in most cases, it wasn't that most of the things that we would do would be like normal things that we would do in a classroom, but it kind of helps to keep the parents knowing what we're doing and involved in some way. I don't know. I think I remember reading that because I was asking that question myself.
And I also wonder if it's something that can be discussed at like parent-teacher conferences, more as a dialogue versus a permission slip kind of format, since most of this is the work that we're already doing every day in our classroom.
I mean, even as early as back to school night, you know, something is just, this is part of our class. This is part of my job as your teacher, in order to ensure that your student makes the progress that they need to. And it's just commonplace. And I think that's definitely going to rely heavily on that relationship building, which we have to do anyway, right? So that trust is there.
Stephanie, I agree with the process of writing it all up and doing it for this class. That's something that we would do normally anyway in our classrooms as good teachers, is research a problem, try some interventions, see if they work. It's just part of the classroom procedures.
And since I teach kindergarten, we do a kind of a different report card. It's called Gold, which has a lot of observational, and we're able to take pictures and videos. And as soon as we explain to parents what we're using it for and how we're using it, they get really excited about it. And I think, you know, that directly relates to kind of this research that we're going to be taking videos and notes about them, and parents really, you know, jump on board that it's for the student, but also for me to get a better picture about them.
And these chapters did have a lot on permissions, because if you're doing it for an outside entity, so if you were writing up, which is why we're not doing the full-blown research project, because if you were writing it up for the university, so an outside entity outside of your school, you would need to get those permissions. If you're publishing it or presenting it beyond your school, I'm not sure, the district part is kind of fuzzy, but if it's outside of that, you definitely want to make sure you get parent permission. So it's partly, it's not always what you're doing, it's what you're doing it for and who is the audience. The other thing is that you always want to maintain confidentiality. So even if you're presenting it within your school or district, you want to give your students, unless you have specific permission and there's a reason to have their names identified, you normally would have pseudonyms. for the students instead of their actual real names. So, and if they had some kind of really distinguishing characteristic that would make someone know who that student was, you leave it out or you adjust it so that they're not recognizable. But that's a really good question, and that is why we, with the university, are only going to this point. We're only going to the point of you guys designing the research and field testing and giving us feedback on your field testing. And we will have you do your observation protocol, but ask you to change all the student names just so we can see that your observation protocols have the kind of emphasis and depth that they need to have to accomplish your objective. But they also will not be used or shared with peers or anyone else. So it's a confidentiality piece is part of all of that. And so most of what you were reading were those university professors, and all of those assignments they were asking students to submit to the university. So that was part of the reason for that. But should you want to present it somewhere, the work that you're doing, then it would be important to get your family's informed consent. And those examples were good ones that were in the Shigori book. Any other thoughts or questions about that? All right, let's go to group 2, question 2. I feel like a talk show host. I think it's because you guys are all these tiles, these lovely faces as tiles on my screen.
So our question was from chapter 5, and it is, how can I be sure that my research findings support my claim?
What do y'all think? Hop in.
I kind of think it's just like what we just answered, that, what is it, triangular piece that you're validating information. Sorry, where it was. Validating your information from other perspectives and different views. So I think that would kind of be a good piece to validate your research, as long as you got that other pieces.
That's what I'm thinking.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you have a critical friend or a learning partner, I think that's someone you can also rely on to look over your research design, go back to your question, go back to your claim. And I think it's someone that you trust too. So I think you would take their feedback seriously. That could be another tool.
I think it probably also comes down to how you collect the data. And is your data actually collection matching the purpose of your study? And that may need to be adjusted if it's not.
Yeah, and aligned with that is, again, that field testing of your tools. Like, did you field test them? Are they measuring what you intend for them to measure? Those are important. All of those steps help make for a trustworthy and reliable study. Any other thoughts? Group 3.
Okay. Our question was in chapter 6. It says, reliability and credibility are key criteria in quality research. How will you make your research open to critique in order to check its reliability and credibility?
You guys are not rushing to the mute button.
I think the triangulation obviously comes back in, but I also think this is a really great opportunity to share your work with other colleagues. And I know we've talked a lot about how we're learning all these things and we want to share them out. And I think this is a perfect way to do it. Like sharing what you found and asking for their feedback on it, but that kind of also gives them the opportunity to start trying some of these things.
I think too, sometimes when you measure it against some of the literature that you've read, And I think that that's, to me, kind of the value of the literature studies that we do, because you kind of see, you kind of want to see that obviously some things might be the same, but, you know, hopefully with some of your research, you do find some things that are also different, but not so far out there that I think if they were, you'd maybe start to ask those questions as to maybe kind of the credibility or whatever.
Erin, could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, sorry. It says, how will you make your research open to critique in order to check its reliability and credibility? So I think when Stephanie, I don't want to speak with Stephanie's question. I think we're also thinking about, like, how are you going to make sure that you're available to that critique, I guess? Like, prepared for the critiquing?
Well, and that, I mean, that goes even to what we did tonight, and getting, you know, giving peer feedback and getting peer feedback and being open to improvement, that we don't have all the answers and our product isn't always perfect the way it is. It can almost always use other opinions and sets of eyes to make our work stronger. So I think it's a good connection between that, what we did just now, and what we're doing going forward, and kind of the thought process that we need to be open to. Did anyone have anything else to add?
Well, I'm thinking just not in here, like in this form with these peers, but also back in our schools with our teammates, to get their critique and their feedback as well, because they know what we're doing and they know our kids, and they could probably offer us a lot of tips and support.
I think even like feedback and critique from the students. And did it work for them? And was it something that helped them? Or were they like, I don't know what you're doing. Why are you making me use this strategy? It's not helping. So getting feedback from them as well is really important to look at.
And I think just remembering where our questions came from and realizing that it is a call to action, and wanting and seeing that change needs to happen, that hopefully with that lens, it's easier to take on feedback because it's for like the common good of our practice.
I'm going to bounce off of Callie's, but I think like kids give us the most genuine feedback, and they'll tell you if it just is stupid, and you can sit there and go back to the drawing board, and you can really just like be like, okay, well, what do you think? And you can bounce the ideas off of them, because the more say they have, I feel like the more engaged they are, especially as you get into the higher grades, like 6, 7, 8 and older. They really want to be a part of it, and when you have them buy in, like amazing things happen.
And remember that because of the nature of your project and your action research, remember when we did statistics, that we're not going to be doing big generalizations to global, something that is going to work for everybody in the world. In actuality, what you're going to implement is going to work for you, your group of kids, in this particular time and space. It may not, even any teacher that has been teaching more than 3 or 4 years knows that an activity works very well. Heck, it may work in a period and not work on the next period with a different group of students. So, but with that said, something that you guys said earlier, a good way to do reliability would be to let some of your team members in the same age group to try your strategy. And see if it works in the classroom. And if it's a good strategy, that, you know, it's really not going to do anything in terms of universality to it or generalizing to anybody. But if it works in your classroom, share, and it is a way of doing some reliability.
And we had some really great outcomes last year with students who were able to bring this kind of culture of inquiry back to their schools. So, you know, you kind of are maybe leading the charge in your school, or maybe you're not, maybe you're one of others who are also doing this kind of work. But I think as the numbers grow in a school around the culture of inquiry, I think that all of your practices then are open to critique, and then they're open to improvement. And I think that's a huge benefit of you connecting with your colleagues at work, is kind of developing that culture of inquiry. Are we in group Was that group 3 that just went? Okay, group 4. What question do you guys have?
We had, how do I ensure rigor without bias while collecting data?
How do I ensure rigor without bias? Correct?
Yes.
How do you check in your biases?
What's that?
How do you check in your biases? Try to check in at the door your bias. Like, I don't know. Do you think you can conduct the research without any value or biases? Or put them up front first? I think historically what we've been told is that we only know what we know, right? And we have a perception of the world that you can't get rid of. And so, but what the metacognition and the self-awareness and the critical thinking comes from knowing that, not from getting rid of that. Because I don't think we can get rid of it. Some of it we may, but for the most, we just need to check that we have them and be aware that everything we do in life may be departing from some of these biases, and try to be aware of that. But the biases will be there if we go unchecked. So I don't know, in doing research, what do you guys think? How do you minimize the effect of your biases to guarantee rigor in your research?
Well, I think part of it is making sure you're focusing on like one variable so that other factors aren't influencing what you're trying to figure out. And I think that's really hard because there are so many things happening in the classroom that affect other things that it's hard to understand if what you were doing is actually the cause of what happened. So I don't know, I didn't answer any questions.
Yeah, there is a researcher effect. There is a whole paragraph you write in your conclusions about researcher effect on the results. You got to be aware of that. Mm-hmm. You are part of it. You are in the classroom. You're implementing it. So you're going to have a huge effect on how that's going to work. There's no way around it. Your instruments, the way you create your instrumentation, huge to minimize bias effect. The operationalizing your variables, so you know exactly what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. That will minimize your bias as well.
I like how you kind of mentioned kind of writing them out before you do your research, because then you're kind of aware of them, and then just kind of having a colleague that really can be honest with you and is willing to give you good critical feedback. Because I know I'm the type of person that you kind of want something to work, and you'll kind of make it work. If you need to, because you want it to work. But I also, and I guess a good connection would be, not saying that I necessarily do this, but when I think of individual educator goals, when it's tied to things that really are important to you, it's hard to do something that could possibly fail, and so that's why I think it's important to bring other people into your research, because sometimes people can keep us honest. And just going into it just with the expectation that it's okay if it doesn't work out the way that I want it to. And actually that's what I want to know. You have to go in wanting to know that. So, I kind of share that.
And then there's member checking, which we kind of went over a little bit earlier, but that would relate to having the people who participate in the research giving you feedback on what your perceived results are. And does that seem to hold true? Does that sound like something that they could believe? Sometimes, like if you have really young students, you'd have to, you'd only give them parts of it, but maybe the parts that you're really questioning, did I get this right?
And you're right, Jeremiah. I don't know exact examples. We could Google it, but both in medical research and technological research, a lot of the new technologies we have, and not a lot, but a few, and some of the medications we get are effects of different effect from the research than what the researchers expected. They implemented a medication and then they're like, oh, well, it didn't do this, but we realized that it did this, and some new technology was found that way too. We're doing military technology for some things, and a different effect happen from that research. So be open to that. That happens a lot.
And working with high school students, I like that idea of just really asking them as you kind of look at the results, because something that you may think that really worked out the way that you think it worked out, they have sometimes different feedback, because there's times that I think things work a certain way and they happen because of certain things. But, you know, sometimes getting their perspectives, they may agree with you, but for different reasons. But they also may disagree and just give you their perspective, which is also just kind of good to hear. So I kind of like that idea as well.
Well, good. I think it sounds like you guys all did some close reading of the material and have a good sense of those chapters, which set us up really well for the next piece. We're going to look next at specific categories of data that we can use. Jose, are you taking a picture of the group? Okay.
I'm sorry, I took a picture. I'll post it. It's teaching in the 21st century. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. This is incredible. This is what we look like. It's a classroom, a 21st century classroom.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to share with you guys all, because I could see
it. Looks good to me. It looks good.
You might have to get my parents' permission for that, Jose.
I like it. All right. Okay, so with regard to the data that you're going to collect, we had asked you in your skeletons, even at the very beginning, to be thinking about how can you measure what you're proposing. And so we haven't spent any time really examining that in any kind of depth. We just wanted it to remain in the forefront of your mind. And then as we proceed forward, some of those things you've already identified may be perfect and they may be exactly what you need, but you may also rethink some things after tonight's conversation and next week's readings. Those should be kind of the bulk. Last week's and then next week's readings will be the bulk of the material on data collection. But data collection for qualitative research generally falls into three separate categories. So it falls into the category of artifacts, and a lot of the artifacts are things that you guys are already doing, and they might be things you're already doing that will help respond to your question. So this particular slide comes from Hendrix, who we're reading for next week, but she talks about artifacts being either teacher generated or student generated. Teacher generated or student generated would be like the tests, the test results really, and how students are doing on that test, the written assignments that they submit, a performance or piece of artwork that they might do, maybe some projects, journals, self-assessments, or peer review. Those all count as student-generated artifacts. And then there's the teacher-generated artifacts that might be useful to you. And many students used a teacher-generated artifact last year, but lesson plans. So if you're talking about specifically implementing a language strategy, your lesson plan should reflect that, right? So that might be a useful source of data. Journals, if you keep a journal, a self-assessment, or a peer review. The other thing to note is that we're going to ask that you have a minimum of one data source from each of these three categories. So you'd have a minimum of one, and you can have more than that, but we want to make sure that you cover these in an effort to provide you the opportunity for triangulation. So one from artifacts, and then observational data. We're going to ask that all of you do observational record / field notes. And we'll work a lot on that next week. You'll read about it for next week, and I think it's next week that you read about it, but you will be working on field notes and creating the observational protocol, which are most of my teachers prefer to call look-fors. That was more teacher-friendly language last semester. Logs, narratives, checklists, tally sheets. I have a lot of my teachers use tally sheets in combination with field notes or observational records. So for example, if you want to see how many times in a student group students are building off of one another's ideas, you might tally that. It might be a quick way to collect data across the group of what's happening if you're looking at, for example, student moves. Videotapes, the most powerful data collection for the kind of work you're doing is going to be videotapes with audio. Now, you need to make sure if you choose to proceed with this that you're following whatever your school and district guidelines are around videotaping, and that you have either blanket permission or individual permission to have students videotape, because that's one place that you can get yourself in trouble if you're not following the established rules in your school or district around that. Photographs, a lot of times we see students taking, or researchers taking photographs of anchor charts or material that was written on the board to figure out a math problem. So seating, how are kids seated? Not always with the kids in it, but how are they grouped and how is the room set up? That's often an important source of data, particularly if you didn't happen to have video. Audio tapes, some of my students chose to do audio tapes because they were finding their students were too self-conscious with the video recording devices, that they weren't doing what they were expected to be doing. Organizational charts and maps, and behavioral scales. Those were all components of observational data. And then the third category is inquiry data, or Hendricks calls inquiry data. And that is composed of interviews, focus groups, conferencing, surveys and questionnaires, and attitude scales. We will be doing a whole lesson, a mini lesson next week on interviews, so that you know how to conduct them and how to construct them. And the same kinds of principles apply to focus groups. So what you learn about for interviews would also apply for focus groups. So if those were areas that you wanted to do some research. Do these seem to be aligned with a lot of your ideas that you had in your skeleton about what kinds of material you would collect or what data you would collect? I'm seeing some nods, but I only get to see like 5 of you, so when I'm sharing the screen. What questions do you have? All right. I'm going to assume that you had time to unmute. We're going to move on. So we were going to ask you guys to go into triads, but it takes us too long to get you into groups for a 5-minute thing. We'd have to do it for longer. So we don't have longer. So we're just I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody, and we're going to talk about the mentor text. So if everyone could pull up the mentor text, it's in the course in week 8, and I believe it's called Research Planning Mentor Text. Yeah, mentor text, RESH Research Planning Matrix. So if you guys could pull that up, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody. Okay. So Jose, you want to walk them through the mentor text, or do you want me to?
Maybe you.
Maybe me. Okay.
I'm trying to figure. I can't see the PowerPoint now, but let me. Yeah, do it. You got it down.
Okay. So if we look at this mentor text, the student's question was, what happens to reading comprehension when student conversations and thinking prompts are integrated into the literature discussion? So you guys are all going to complete one of these, and so the reason we're looking at this so that you get a good sense of kind of what do these categories look like when they're completed. So the first column talks about what data sources will answer the question, and seeking 3 to 5 sources per research question. But sometimes those same resources or same sources would answer multiple questions. So for example, teacher observation data often answers sub-questions as well as the overarching question. The idea here is that if you have sub-questions, you do want to line them out and make sure that you have data sources that connect directly with that question. So the data sources the student had for answering her question about the effects on reading comprehension is she had teacher observation, she has a unit pre and post assessment on reading comprehension, she has reading journal samples from the students, she has audio recording of the literature discussions, and student surveys. So the next column asks, how will each of these sources help you answer your research question? So she goes through and says, okay, with my teacher observation protocol, exactly what is that going to provide for me around the research question? So this student wrote, this data source will help to document the literature discussion interactions between students and teachers. And she goes on with each one of the different data sources. Exactly how will that help you go back to the original question? So this is all tracking back to that original question there. What will you specifically look for or listen for with this data source? So an observation protocol, eventually she'll develop this out into kind of a more formalized observation protocol, but she's first starting to think about, well, what exactly am I going to look for while I'm teaching or while I'm observing my students in groups, what am I going to watch for? So she says in this case, she's looking for student engagement, comprehension strategies, conversation strategies, students prepared and present, and student group organization. So each of her data sources, she goes through and talks about what specifically within that is she going to be looking for to go back to that question. So everything's tied really carefully to that question, the original question. And then finally, the final column asks, are baseline data important in order to understand or answer your research question? If so, what data can you use or collect to provide baseline data? So her second data source has a pre and post. So of course that baseline data means like before your intervention. So you need, especially if you're trying to show any kind of change, you need to establish what is it like? What are these factors or variables? How are they responding prior to intervention or prior to you implementing your strategy so that you have something to compare to after you implement your strategy. So that's what that baseline piece is looking for. Do you need to collect something or think about something along lines of that data source prior to implementing your strategy? So given that, do you guys see is there any information that appears to be missing from here? I picked the students because in the future, we're going to be looking at her actual data, her raw data. So I figured if we're going to look at a source, a student source, we might as well look at the one we're going to look at in other parts of the class. So she wasn't selected particularly because, you know, her data plan was perfect. I can't see anything that is obviously missing to me, but do you see anything, Jose? Or was it, no, it wasn't missing. It was, yeah.
I was looking at, because I don't think anything is missing, but I'm just curious to help our students. Now, if you pay attention, the student says she's going to do teacher observation. She's going to use an observation protocol, and she tells us how the observation protocol is going to help her. And then what she's looking for with that observation protocol is the content of the observation protocol, in a sense. I'm not sure how the instrument looks at the end, but when she says student engagement, comprehension strategies, conversation strategies, student prepare and present, these, however she's going to take notes on these, on a number value or a check mark value, I'm not sure, but that is the content of the observation protocol.
Yeah, so it becomes a formalized observation protocol with more specific detail as to what does she mean by student engagement. Is she looking for time on task? So that's more specified in the formal tool. But here she's putting together kind of the broad categories of what kinds of things is she going to look for when she has observation. All right, the other quote, was anything surprising to any of you?
I was just going to add, it seems like almost a baseline would be helpful. Like if you did something at the beginning of the class just to really see where kids are at when they kind of come in or at a certain point, just using kind of all those look fors at the beginning without prompts without thinking prompts or whatever else she was going to add in there, because then it might show some of that significance. So
yeah, I don't disagree, Jeremiah. I think baseline data, it could be relevant here. I personally prefer baseline data across most of my data sources so that first of all, if none of them are, the more sources I have baseline data with, the more opportunities I have to see change. And if I'm not seeing any, then I have to start to wonder, am I implementing this well? Are my research tools sensitive enough to pick it up? So it starts to create questions for me about what I'm doing and whether or not what I'm doing is working and it just doesn't have enough time, but having more baseline data gives me a faster view of whether or not I need to rethink things.
More accurate as well, and perhaps going back to the bias issue, because in this teacher observation protocol, he may be able to just, I'm going to guess that since she is not establishing a baseline data for it, that she may just be doing an introduction, some kind of narrative where she says, my students are having issues participating without prompts, this and that. So she may give us a picture of what these literature discussions look like without these interventions. Would it be more, but that's her perception and her bias, and maybe just based on informal observations. If she uses the same protocol with those categories and more, operationalized, more defined, and maybe she can see really if they were not engaged in that, and if after the intervention she sees a big difference, it may compensate for some bias. But I'm thinking in general terms, it may be valid that she may just do like a 1 or 2 page introduction, giving us a narrative of what the classroom looks like in these literature discussions.
Yeah. Okay, does anyone have any questions related to completing a chart like this for yourself? Okay, I'm seeing no's. So now until 8:05, we're gonna ask that you guys, you can stay and just mute yourself or turn off your video. I hate working with the video on. I don't know, it's just weird. But if you have questions that arise, that was the whole point of you guys starting work with us present. We don't always expect you to finish the work, but that way, if you get started and you get into it, you dig into it, you get an opportunity to kind of see where the challenges arise so that you have us and your peers available to ask questions. So the research planning matrix, there's a template that's in week 8 that's empty. And you guys can just download it to your machine and start filling it out. So we're going to come back for kind of a wrap up at 8:05. Does anyone have any questions before you go? Okay. We'll see you back here in a few minutes.
I didn't, in the picture, 2 students were looking sideways and there's no children, which I think only Elise, Stephanie has a baby on the, like, it looks like a cocoon, like a baby blue thingy. You can't see faces. So I think that's, I'll post it in the discussions. And if anybody complains to you, take it out. If people are like, I don't want my face or whatever. Wait, what? Okay.
All right. Just waiting on a couple more people. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, I know what I was going to do. I was like sharing my screen. I had a technical problem and then everything. I forgot what I was doing. Okay, so revisiting goals from tonight. Students evaluated Pear's research skeleton and offered substantive feedback for improvement. Students discussed research planning, validity, and reliability. Students examined mentor research plan and described positive attributes. Students identified data sources that align with their research question. Just for a little bit of feedback, did anyone come up with questions that the whole group would benefit from by going through that, the research planning chart?
Do we need to include all of our sub-questions too? She only has her main research question listed.
So if your sub-questions would generate different data sources, then you should have them.
And you need to have 3 to 5 different data sources for those sub-questions?
They could be the same. So you might, so say she was looking at some subset question and was using teacher observation, she might have observational protocol that includes things that would meet all of her different questions, but just one protocol. So yes, you would want 3 to 5 because you're seeking triangulation in your data. So most of you, I was looking at your feedback just now on your reflective check-in. Most of you are getting that triangulation is related to your data sources, but there were a few of you that would benefit from hearing this again, that triangulation is when you have 3 different data sources that are intended to answer your research question, and that data align. So you're able to show that your teacher observation protocol and your student survey and maybe your student writing journal all have evidence of supporting what your claim is. So if you make a claim that students improved in their reading comprehension, now you have 3 sources of evidence that you can use to support that, which you really need to have for triangulation, which is what establishes a lot of the credibility in qualitative research. Any other questions come up? Okay. The other part is for next week, rather than doing, so you'll have 3 readings, the chapter 4 in Shigori Hubbard Miller, that's the text that you guys have. And then I have just put together another spot for you. Well, I made it clearer where everything was in the, oh, that's not it either. In World Class. So goodness gracious, nothing's updated. Here we go. So the materials for next week, those other 2 readings from, they're from the same authors, but the authors' last names changed and they're different. Miller, Power, Shigori Hubbard, one of them dropped one of the names. But they're older, they're from older texts that they had. So those 2 are included in the World Class. And then instead, next week, instead of, I can just show you here. We're going to have you guys do 2-column notes instead of your regular reading response, in part because these readings are going to be really essential for you to be able to write your observation protocols and to understand how field notes work. So we kind of wanted them more as for you to be able to use as guidance as you're working through how to actually write field notes. So we felt like 2-column notes would be a more appropriate way for you guys to be collecting that information than writing kind of a narrative piece. And then if you can please put your research planning chart that you started just now, if you can complete that and put it in the discussion forum, that will be what you discuss with your peers next week. So we'll be getting peer feedback on your research planning chart next week. The one other question, Jose and I were curious, and I can stop sharing so I can see everybody. We were just wondering how you guys felt that Zoom worked for you tonight for learning as a whole group. Thumbs up? Okay. So there's no one that felt that you would have benefited from spending the 3.5 hours in the classroom space tonight? Okay. So Jose and I were under the impression that this was functioning, but again, you know, it can appear that everyone's doing well, and in fact, people are feeling like this isn't working for them, and we don't know that. So, and I love all of the photo bombing, video bombing going on. Let's say you just had a video bomb.
That's Luna. Everybody, that's Luna. She's like that in her classroom too. She's an entertainer.
For sure. Great. So were there any other questions that you guys had before you sign off? Great. There were a couple of you that didn't do the reflective check-in. Can you please make sure you do that?
There's a question, Kelly.
Okay.
I'm not seeing everybody though.
You can see people if you change.
Okay, there I am. All right. With the 2-column notes, is there some specific way you want us to do that, or is there a template on what you want us to focus on? Or?
There's some guidance on how, if you've not done them before, I just put some guidance in that same folder. A lot of you, I expect, to do 2-column notes with your students, and if you do them with students, that's fine. If this is a new idea to you, just check out the resource that I posted in week 8 with the Shigori readings. Thank you. You always ask me those important questions, Tanya. The detail questions. Anything else for the good of the order? Darcy? Oh, you're not muted, but I can't hear you.
Oh.
There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So I was just wondering, with the reflective feedback that we got from peers, when do we need to make those changes? Is there a due date? Do we resubmit? How does that work?
That's a great question, Darcy. So in 2 weeks, so not next week, we wanted to give you time to kind of sit with it. So in 2 weeks, October 30th, I think, you'll submit your revised skeleton and attach the feedback that you got from your peers to the Dropbox. And there's a Dropbox, it's week 10. So there's a Dropbox for that.
Okay.
If you didn't manage to finish the peer review, please finish tonight so that your peers have that material and can continue moving forward. If you have questions from your peers, please ask. If something doesn't make sense and you know there's a critique and you really don't know how to fix it, ask your peer. That's the purpose of that. So just reach out, send a text, send an email on World Class, and it might take a couple of days, but if you guys would kind of keep track of World Class, check in once in a while and see if anyone's sent you anything. Great. Well, thank you all. It was fun with the 21st century Zoom 21-person discussion. It's amazing. Good night.
Bye. That's true. That's true.
All right. Well, I'll see you on Thursday.
See you Thursday, Kelly.
Bye.
Adios.